There are some stories American history tried to bury, not by accident but deliberately. Stories so disturbing, so fundamentally challenging to the social order, that entire communities conspired to erase them from memory. What I'm about to share with you is one of those stories, a tale documented in property deeds, coroner's reports, and private journals that were sealed for over a century. A story about a man named Moses who achieved something that should have been impossible under every law of the antebellum South. In the autumn of 1852, a document was filed in Ascension Parish, Louisiana, that puzzled the parish clerk so deeply he wrote in the margin, "God have mercy on us." The document recorded that a man born into slavery had become the legal owner of the plantation where he had once been property. But the story didn't end there. Within 40 days of his former master's funeral, Moses married the widow, a white woman from a respected Creole family. And in the year that followed, 6 people who questioned his rise to power died under circumstances the authorities refused to investigate thoroughly. The question that haunted everyone who knew the truth was simple but terrifying. How many people had to die to make this impossible transformation possible? My name is attached to this investigation, and I've spent months piecing together what really happened at Bellerive Plantation. The documents don't lie. The evidence exists in parish records, sealed testimonies, and private journals that were never meant to see daylight. What I've discovered challenges everything we think we know about power, survival, and the darkness that slavery created in the American South. Let me take you back to where it all began. The Mississippi River Delta in Louisiana, 1850. The soil ran black and rich, a perfect for sugarcane that fetched premium prices in New Orleans. Bellerive Plantation sprawled across nearly 800 acres, marked by ancient laics draped in Spanish moss that seemed to absorb the heavy Louisiana air. The main house rose 3 stories tall, built in the French colonial style with wide galleries and tall windows designed to catch the river breeze. Henri Beauchamp had inherited Bellerive from his father in 1838, along with 63 enslaved people, a sugar mill, and debts that would have crushed a lesser man. But Henri was ambitious, calculating, possessed of a particular kind of intelligence that recognized opportunity where others saw only obstacles. By 1850, he had expanded his holdings to 92 slaves and established himself among the parish's planter elite. What made Henri different from other planters was his willingness to observe and learn from those he owned. And this brings us to Moses had been born on Bellerive in 1822. The estate books listed his mother as Patience, a woman who worked in the main house. His father's name was never recorded. From childhood, Moses displayed qualities that both fascinated and unsettled those around him. He learned to read by watching Henri's children study with their tutor, memorizing lessons through the parlor window. He taught himself carpentry by observing the plantation's craftsmen, then surpassed their skill before his 15th birthday. Most remarkably, Moses possessed an ability to read people, to understand their fears, desires, and with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. Henri Beauchamp made a decision that most planters would have considered dangerous. He gave Moses responsibility, first as a driver overseeing field hands, then as a mill operator, and eventually as his personal assistant in managing the estate's business affairs. Henri kept Moses close, relied on his judgment, trusted him with information that other slaves never accessed. It was an arrangement that benefited both men. Henri's profits increased significantly under Moses's efficient management. Moses gained knowledge and influence impossible for someone in his position. But there was a complexity to their relationship that outsiders could not fully perceive. In 1845, Henri's wife Celeste arrived at Bellerive. She was 19 years old, the daughter of a declining Creole family in New Orleans. Her father had accumulated gambling debts that threatened to destroy the family's reputation. Marrying her to the wealthy Henri Beauchamp, 15 years her senior, had been a strategic solution. Celeste brought beauty, refinement, and social connections to Bellerive. She brought no affection for her husband. By the spring of 1852, Bellerive appeared to be thriving. The previous harvest had been exceptional. Henri had negotiated favorable contracts with New Orleans factors. The main house hosted dinner parties where parish elite gathered to discuss politics and the growing tensions between North and South. Henri spoke passionately about states' rights and the Southern way of life, never acknowledging the irony that his eloquent defenses were often informed by observations Moses had shared with him earlier that same day. But beneath this prosperous surface, tensions were building that would soon tear Bellerive apart. Moses had spent 30 years watching, learning, and waiting. He understood the plantation's operations better than Henri himself. He knew which neighboring planters were on the verge of bankruptcy, which factors in New Orleans could be manipulated, which laws could be exploited, and which people could be influenced. He had been preparing for something, though few suspected what or when it would come. The evening of June 17, 1852, began like countless others at Bellerive. The day's heat had been oppressive, even by Louisiana standards. Henri Beauchamp had spent the day reviewing account books with Moses, discussing the upcoming planting season and a potential land purchase from a neighboring planter, whose son's gambling debts had grown unmanageable. At 7 o'clock, Henri dismissed Moses and called for his evening meal to be brought to his study. He had letters to write, he said, and preferred to work undisturbed. This was not unusual. Henri often conducted business correspondence in the evening. Louisa, who managed the household, supervised as Jax, the plantation cook, prepared a tray with cold chicken, bread, cheese, and a bottle of Henri's preferred claret. Margaret, Celeste's personal maid, carried the tray upstairs, knocked on the study door, received Henri's acknowledgement, and left it on the table just inside the entrance. What happened in the hours that followed has been reconstructed from testimony given during the inquiry, though significant gaps remain. At approximately 9:30, Tobias Greenleaf, the senior overseer making his evening rounds, noticed that lamplight still burned in Henri's study. At the time, it seemed unremarkable. At some point between 9:30 and 11 o'clock, someone entered Henri's study. The door had been locked from the inside. Whoever entered possessed either a key or the ability to persuade Henri to unlock it. At 11:45, Louisa was awakened by a sound she described as something heavy falling. She rose, lit a candle, and made her way through the dark house toward Henri's study. The door stood slightly ajar. She was certain it had been closed when she passed by earlier. Lamplight spilled into the hallway. She pushed the door open and saw Henri Beauchamp slumped in his desk chair, his head thrown back at an unnatural angle, his hunting rifle across his lap, and a significant amount of blood on the wall behind him. Louisa's scream brought the household running. Within minutes, Moses, Celeste, Margaret, the Greenleaf brothers, and several house servants had gathered in the study. The scene appeared straightforward. Henri had shot himself with his own rifle, the barrel placed beneath his chin. The weapon was one he kept mounted above his desk, a Kentucky long rifle that had belonged to his grandfather. Powder burns marked his chin and throat. The bullet had exited through the top of his skull, lodging in the ceiling beam above. Tobias Greenleaf immediately assumed command, as was expected given his position. He ordered everyone except his brother Samuel out of the room, then dispatched a rider to fetch Dr. Matthias Fentress from his home 5 miles distant. Dr. Fentress arrived shortly after 1 in the morning. He examined the body briefly, confirmed the obvious cause of death, and estimated that Henri had been dead approximately 2 to 3 hours. He noted the powder burns, the trajectory of the bullet, and the position of the body. His initial conclusion was suicide. However, Fentress also observed 7 tales that troubled him enough to include them in a separate, more detailed report he would later submit to the parish coroner. First, Henri's hands showed no powder residue beyond what one would expect from recently handling the rifle. Second, the rifle had been across Henri's lap in a position that seemed awkward for someone who had just used it to shoot himself. Third, a bottle of claret on the desk was nearly empty, but Henri was known as a moderate drinker who rarely consumed more than 2 glasses with dinner. Fourth, and most disturbing, Henri's face bore an expression that Dr. Fentress struggled to characterize. Not the blank emptiness of sudden death, but something that resembled profound surprise mixed with what the doctor could only describe as recognition. As if Henri had understood something important in his final moment. The official investigation began at dawn. Sheriff Antoine Thériault arrived from the parish seat accompanied by 2 deputies and a justice of the peace. They examined the study, questioned the household, and reviewed Dr. Fentress's preliminary findings. By noon, they had reached their conclusion. Henri Beauchamp had taken his own life while intoxicated and despondent over financial troubles. The verdict satisfied legal requirements and preserved the family's reputation. Suicide was scandal enough without adding suggestions of foul play or household conspiracy. But several people's official verdict difficult to accept. Tobias Greenleaf insisted that Henri had shown no signs of despondency and had in fact been enthusiastic about upcoming business ventures. Henri's brother Armand, who arrived late on the 18th, pointed out that the family's finances were actually quite healthy. Dr. Fentress privately maintained his reservations about certain physical evidence. And Louisa, who had served the Beauchamp family for 45 years, told anyone who would listen that Henri was not the type of man who would abandon his responsibilities through suicide, no matter what troubles he faced. Yet the inquiry was closed. The death certificate was signed, and preparations for Henri's burial proceeded. During the 5 days between death and burial, Bellerive Plantation existed in a strange state of suspension. All normal work continued, but everyone understood that fundamental change was coming. Armand had legal authority as Henri's closest male relative, but he lived in Baton Rouge and had his own affairs to manage. Celeste was Henri's widow and would inherit significant assets, but Louisiana law restricted women's control over property. The Greenleaf Brers assumed would step into positions of greater authority, but they needed someone with legal standing to sign their orders. Moses continued managing daily operations as he had under Henri, and everyone accepted this arrangement because the alternative was chaos. He met with Armand to review accounts. He corresponded with Henri's factor in New Orleans about existing contracts. He made decisions about planting schedules that could not wait. He did all of this with the same calm competence he had always shown. And people began to forget, or perhaps they never truly believed, that his legal status had not changed. He was still enslaved. On June 21st, the evening before Henri's funeral, Moses requested a private meeting with Celeste. They met in the small parlour off the main hall. Margaret stood outside the closed door. Propriety required a witness to any meeting between a white woman and an enslaved man, but she later testified that she could not hear what was discussed. The meeting lasted approximately 45 minutes. When Moses emerged, his expression revealed nothing. When Celeste emerged 10 minutes later, she looked as if she had made a decision that both terrified and relieved her. Henri's funeral took place on a Wednesday afternoon with heat so oppressive that several attendees fainted during the graveside service. Father Dominique Lant conducted the ceremony, speaking of Henri's contributions to the parish, his business acumen, and his devotion to the Southern cause. He did not mention suicide. Such things were not discussed openly, but everyone present understood the implications. Henri Beauchamp departed immediately after the funeral, explaining that urgent business required his return to Baton Rouge. Before leaving, he had a brief conversation with Tobias Greenleaf, in which he stated that the plantation's management would remain under current arrangements until the estate was properly settled. What those current arrangements were exactly, he did not specify. That evening, as the household was settling after the exhausting day, Louisa was cleaning Henri's study when she noticed something that stopped her cold. The hunting rifle that had killed Henri was back in its usual place above the desk. She was certain it had been taken as evidence by Sheriff Theriot. She was even more certain that she had not seen anyone return it. She mentioned this to Moses, who told her that Armand had arranged for its return before departing. This explanation was reasonable, yet something about the way Moses delivered it, or perhaps something about the way the rifle now hung, cleaned and oiled as if waiting to be used again, left Louisa profoundly uneasy. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. This is a story that was deliberately buried for generations, and your engagement helps bring these forgotten truths to light. The weeks following Henri's death revealed fractures in Bellerive's social structure that had always existed beneath the surface but had been held in check by the weight of established authority. With that authority removed, every relationship, every assumption, every unspoken arrangement came into question, and Moses continued to run Bellerive's operations with an efficiency that even the Greenleaf brothers could not fault. The crops were tended, the mill operated profitably, contracts with New Orleans factors were maintained. On paper, nothing had changed. In practice, everything had changed. Moses no longer sought approval for his decisions. He no longer presented plans for someone else to authorize. He simply acted, and the momentum of habit, combined with the absence of clear alternative authority, meant that people accepted his actions as legitimate. But those who worked in the main house knew better. Margaret, whose position as Celeste's personal maid gave her intimate access to her mistress's private life, observed meetings between Celeste and Moses that occurred with increasing frequency and decreasing pretense of propriety. They met in the parlour, in Henri's former study, on the gallery in the evening. They spoke in low voices, sometimes in French, which Moses had somehow learned despite having no formal education. They reviewed documents together, papers covered with legal language and official seals. By late July, Tobias Greenleaf had become convinced that Moses was manipulating Celeste, possibly through threats, possibly through some other form of coercion he could not quite define. He shared these suspicions with his brother, with several neighbouring overseers, and eventually with Sheriff Theriot during a chance meeting in the parish seat. The sheriff listened politely but pointed out that suspicion was not evidence. Unless Greenleaf demonstrate actual wrongdoing, actual crime, there was nothing the law could do. The sheriff also reminded him, with careful emphasis, that making unfounded accusations about a white woman's honour could have severe legal consequences for the accuser. On August 3rd, something occurred that brought these simmering tensions to a brief, explosive confrontation. Moses had arranged the sale of 60 hogsheads of sugar to a New Orleans factor at a price significantly higher than Henri had negotiated for the previous year's crop. This was objectively good business, but Tobias Greenleaf chose to challenge the transaction, arguing that Moses had no authority to negotiate contracts and that the sale should be voided. Moses calmly explained had negotiated the deal on Celeste's behalf, with her full knowledge and approval, and that the contract had already been signed and the first payment received. Greenleaf, his frustration finally boiling over, made the mistake of explicitly stating what many had been thinking. "You forget your place, Moses. You forget what you are." The confrontation took place in the mill office with half a dozen witnesses present. Moses's response was quiet, measured, and absolutely devastating in its precision. "My place is wherever Madame Beauchamp determines it to be. If you question my authority, you question hers. If you question hers, you question the arrangements made by Monsieur Armand before his departure. If you wish to challenge those arrangements, I suggest you travel to Baton Rouge and discuss the matter with him directly. Until you do so, I will continue to perform the duties assigned to me by the mistress of this estate." It was a masterful piece of verbal maneuvering, simultaneously invoking multiple sources of authority while offering no direct challenge to the racial hierarchy that everyone understood governed their world. Greenleaf was trapped. He could not challenge Moses without appearing to challenge Celeste. Could not challenge Celeste without appearing to exceed his own authority. Could not appeal to Armand without admitting that he had lost control of the plantation he was supposed to be supervising. That same evening, Tobias Greenleaf began to write a letter to Henri Beauchamp detailing his concerns about Moses's growing influence and requesting clarification about the estate's management structure. He was still working on this letter 2 days later when he fell ill with symptoms that Dr. Fentress initially diagnosed as cholera. Severe intestinal distress accompanied by vomiting, fever, and delirium. The illness came progressed rapidly and proved fatal within 48 hours. Tobias Greenleaf died on August 7, 1852, 3 days after his confrontation with Moses. Cholera was not uncommon in Louisiana during summer months, particularly near the river. The same week Greenleaf died. 2 slaves from a neighboring plantation and a merchant in the parish seat also succumbed to similar symptoms. Dr. Fentress saw no reason to suspect foul play, though he noted his records that the speed and severity of Greenleaf's decline was unusual, even for cholera. The body was buried quickly. The heat and the nature of the illness made this necessary, and Samuel Greenleaf found himself suddenly elevated to the position of sole overseer. Samuel lacked his brother's forceful personality and his certainty about how things should be. He had relied on Tobias to make difficult decisions, to confront problems directly, to maintain the firm hand that everyone agreed was necessary in managing a large plantation. Without his brother, Samuel felt adrift. When Moses approached 3 days after the funeral with a proposal to restructure the overseer's responsibilities, ostensibly to reduce Samuel's workload during this difficult period, Samuel agreed without fully considering the implications. The new arrangement gave Samuel authority over field operations, while Moses retained control of business affairs, contracts, and financial management. It was, Moses explained, simply a formal recognition of how things had been operating anyway. What Samuel did not realize until too late was that he had just accepted a subordinate position. The person who controls money and contracts controls everything else. Moses now had official, or at least officially recognized, authority over the plantation's most important operations, while Samuel was relegated to supervising manual labor. It was a complete inversion of the normal hierarchy, accomplished so smoothly that Samuel only understood what had happened after the arrangement was already in place and functioning. Throughout these developments, one person watched increasingly sharp attention and growing alarm. Old Jacques, who had cooked for the Beauchamp family for longer than most people on the plantation had been alive, had seen changes of power before. He had watched Henri's father die and Henri assume control. He had observed hirings and firings, marriages and deaths, the constant small negotiations of authority that occurred in any large household. But what he was witnessing now was different. This was not evolution. This was revolution, conducted so gradually that most people did not recognize it as such. Jacques began paying attention to things that others overlooked. He noticed that Celeste no longer took her meals in the formal dining room, but instead ate in her private chambers, with Margot bringing trays that Moses had personally selected from Jacques' kitchen. He observed that Mark carried notes between Moses and Celeste several times each day, more communication than would seem necessary for simple household management. He saw that Louisa, who had once held undisputed authority over the household staff, now consulted with Moses before making decisions about staffing or supplies. Most troubling of all, Jacques noticed that people were disappearing. Not literally disappearing, nothing so dramatic, but gradually being removed from positions where they might observe or interfere with whatever was unfolding. 3 house servants had been reassigned to fieldwork, a change that Moses explained as necessary due to reduced household needs during mourning. 2 field workers known for their loyalty to the Greenleaf brothers had been sold to a neighboring plantation, a transaction Moses described as financially advantageous. The butler, who had served Henri for 15 years, had been dismissed for drunkenness, a charge that Louisa privately disputed but could not disprove. When Jacques mentioned these observations to Louisa, she responded with something that surprised him: fear. Not anger, not indignation, but genuine fear. "Do not speak of these things," she told him. "Do not even think them too loudly. There are changes coming that we cannot prevent, and the only safety is in not noticing them." On September 12, 1852, exactly 12 weeks after Henri Beauchamp's death, Moses appeared before Justice Bedroux in the parish seat, accompanied by Celeste and a lawyer from New Orleans named Edward Lafleur. The purpose of their visit was to present documents related to Henri's estate and to request the court's approval of certain arrangements. The documents included Henri's will, which had apparently been revised just 2 months before his death, a power of attorney granting Celeste authority to manage the estate during probate, and a manumission paper for Moses, signed by Henri on April 15, 1852. The will was straightforward enough. It left the bulk of Henri's estate to Celeste, with provisions for his brother Armand and small bequests to several friends and distant relatives. Nothing in the will was unusual for a man without children. The power of attorney was also unremarkable, giving Celeste broad authority to conduct business on the estate's behalf during the probate period. The manumission paper was more problematic. It stated that Henri Beauchamp, in recognition of Moses's faithful service, exceptional intelligence, and invaluable contributions to the prosperity of Bellerive Plantation, hereby granted him freedom to take effect immediately. It was properly executed Henri's signature, the required witness signatures, but it had never been filed with the parish clerk, as Louisiana law required for manumissions to be legally valid. Moses's lawyer argued that this was a mere technicality, that Henri had clearly intended to grant freedom and had executed the proper document, that the failure to file was an administrative oversight that should not invalidate Henri's explicit wishes. Justice Beauchamp was not a naive man. He understood that looking at a situation that violated every norm of Louisiana society, that challenged assumptions about race and power that formed the foundation of the entire system. He also understood that was being presented with technically legal documents, properly executed and notarized. He could reject them. He had the authority to do so. But on what grounds? Because the situation made him uncomfortable, because it seemed suspicious, because it violated unwritten rules about how things should be. After considerable deliberation, Justice Beauchamp accepted the documents for filing. He approved the manumission, granted Celeste the requested authority, and entered the will into probate. In his private journal that evening, he wrote, "I have today performed an act that may haunt me for the rest of my life. I have set in motion events that I suspect will not end well. But I have been presented with legal documents that meet all requirements of law, and I have no basis on which to reject them. May God forgive me if I have been deceived, and may He protect those who may suffer from my decision." The news of Moses's manumission spread through the parish with remarkable speed. Reactions ranged from disbelief to outrage to a kind of fascinated horror, and neighboring planters began avoiding contact with Bellerive, treating it as if it were contaminated. The parish elite, who had once attended Henri's dinner parties, now refused invitations to visit. Father Leblanc continued his pastoral visits to Celeste, but he made clear his deep reservations about the situation and urged her repeatedly to consider the consequences of her choices. Samuel Greenleaf, upon hearing that Moses was not legally free, submitted his resignation effective immediately. He could not, he said, continue working under such circumstances. Moses accepted his resignation with perfect politeness and hired a new overseer within a week, a man named Amos Pritchett, who had worked on plantations in Mississippi, and who seemed either ignorant of or indifferent to the unconventional arrangement at Bellerive. Throughout all of these developments, Moses maintained the same calm demeanor he had always shown. He conducted business, managed operations, and spoke with unfailing courtesy to everyone. He made no dramatic gestures, issued no proclamations, engaged in no behavior that could be characterized as insolent or presumptuous. He simply continued doing what he had been doing, with the single but monumental difference that he now did it as a free man. The question that everyone asked, that some asked openly and others only in whispers, was how this had happened. How had Moses convinced Henri to sign a manumission paper? How had he obtained Henri's revised will? How had he persuaded Celeste to support his freedom and to work with him in managing the estate? The obvious answer, the answer most people assumed, was that Moses had somehow manipulated or coerced these things through threats, blackmail, or exploitation of Celeste's grief and vulnerability. But a few people, those who had observed most closely, suspected something more complex and more disturbing. They suspected that Moses had spent years, perhaps his entire life, preparing for this moment, that he had studied Henri so thoroughly that he understood exactly how to present himself as indispensable, that he had cultivated Celeste's trust, and possibly her affection, through calculated attention over months or years, that he had positioned himself so strategically that when Henri died, he was the only person who could hold the estate together, making his freery rather than simply desired. And beneath these suspicions lay an even more troubling question that few people dared to voice. Had Henri Beauchamp really taken his own life, or had Moses engineered his death so skillfully that it appeared to be suicide? The official investigation had been cursory, the evidence circumstantial, the conclusion convenient. Fentress's reservations had been noted but never seriously pursued. The hunting rifle had been returned to its place above the desk with suspicious speed, and the one person who had directly challenged Moses's authority, Tobias Greenleaf, had died suddenly just days after that challenge. These questions had no answers, only implications. And the implications were terrifying enough that most people preferred not to think about them too carefully. We're about to reveal what happened next at Bellerive, but first, make sure you're subscribed to Whispers of Mystery so you never miss stories like this. Hit that notification bell, because the most disturbing revelations are still to come. The autumn of 1852 brought cooler weather, but no reduction in the tension surrounding Bellerive. The plantation continued to operate profitably. The crops were harvested successfully. Moses's management proved as it had been under Henri's ownership. But the social isolation of the estate deepened. Neighboring planters refused to conduct business with Bellerive. Merchants provided necessary supplies but did so with cold formality. The few visitors who came were strangers, factors from New Orleans, lawyers, businessmen who cared more about profit than propriety. The true nature of what was occurring at Bellerive became impossible to ignore on November 28, 1852, when Celeste Beauchamp and Moses appeared together at the parish clerk's office to file an application for a marriage license. The clerk, a man named Prosper Gauthier, who had held his position for 23 years, initially assumed he had misunderstood their request. When Moses calmly repeated it, Gauthier's hands began to shake. Moses pointed out, with careful precision, that Louisiana law prohibited marriages between white women and enslaved persons, or recently freed people of color. He was neither. His manumission had been filed in September. He had consulted with in New Orleans who specialized in such matters. He knew exactly which laws applied, and there was no law, no statute, no legal prohibition against what he was requesting. After 3 hours of discussion, during which Gauthier sent messengers to consult with the justice of the peace and reviewed every relevant statute he could find, the clerk found himself unable to identify a specific legal basis to deny the application. He accepted it for filing. But before he did so, he wrote in the margin of the license, "God have mercy on us all." The wedding was arranged quickly. It had to be. No Catholic priest in good standing would perform such a ceremony. The arrangement defrocked priest named Father Matthew Corbeaux, who had been expelled from the diocese 5 years earlier for alcoholism, and who now performed marriages, baptisms, and funerals for a fee. No questions asked, the ceremony took place on December 19, 1852, in Bellerive's parlor. The only witnesses were Louisa Margot Old Jacques and the estate's lawyer, Edward Lafleur. Father Corbeaux stumbled through the liturgy with breath that smelled of whiskey. His hands shook as he held the prayer book. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Celeste's hand trembled as Moses placed a gold ring on her finger. By marrying Celeste, Moses gained legal control of her inheritance from Henri, which meant he now effectively owned Bellerive Plantation. From slave to property owner in exactly 6 months, the reaction from the parish elite was immediate and furious. A group of planters met at Colonel Auguste Chevalier's home to discuss what action should be taken. Some argued for organizing a group of men to ride to Bellerive in the night and resolve the situation permanently. Others argued for legal intervention, for finding some statute, some precedent, some mechanism to void the marriage and strip Moses of his property. They settled on a strategy of complete social and economic isolation. No one would do business with Bellerive. No one would acknowledge Moses or Celeste in public. No merchant would extend credit. No factor would handle their crops. No church would receive them. The parish would treat them as if they did not exist. Moses had anticipated this response. He had already established a relationship with a factor in New Orleans named Joachim Tessier, an ambitious trader who had recently arrived from France and who cared more about profit than about Louisiana's social conventions. Tessier had connections to northern buyers who were happy to purchase Louisiana sugar without concerning themselves with local scandals. The winter of 1853 saw Bellerive operating in complete isolation from its immediate neighbors, but in growing connection to commercial networks that extended far beyond the parish. Celeste remained largely subdued in the main house, appearing in public only when absolutely necessary. Those who saw her described her as pale, thin, and emotionally withdrawn. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice was flat and effectless. Margot, who continued serving as her personal maid, observed that Celeste seemed almost relieved by her new situation. Moses made all decisions, bore all responsibility. A faced Orpley existed in a state of passive acceptance. But during the first months of 1853, several incidents occurred and suggested Moses was consolidating his control by removing potential threats. In February, a field worker named Josiah, who had been on the plantation for over 20 years, claimed to have information about what really happened the night Master Henri died. He told several other workers that he had seen something important, something that would change everything. Before he could share what he with anyone outside the plantation, Josiah disappeared. Moses reported him as a runaway, posted the required notices, offered a reward for his capture. Josiah was never found. In March, Old Jack, with symptoms remarkably similar to those that had killed Tobias Greenleaf, severe intestinal distress, rapid decline, death within 3 days. Fentress performed and certified the death as natural causes. Cholera, most likely, though the symptoms were somewhat atypical. In his private records, however, Dr. Fentress noted something troubling. This was now the third case of sudden, severe illness affecting people who had been in close proximity to the main house at Bellerive. The pattern could be coincidence, but it could also be something else. The most significant incident occurred in April. Samuel Greenleaf, who had left Bellerive after Moses's manumission, had been living in the parish seat and working as a bookkeeper. He had been consumed with the conviction that Moses had murdered his brother and possibly Henri as well. For months, Samuel had been collecting testimony from people who had lived at or visited Bellerive. He interviewed former servants, questioned merchants who had done business with the plantation, and meticulously reviewed parish records looking for inconsistencies. He was building a case, gathering evidence that believed would prove Moses's guilt. On April 12, 1853, Samuel Greenleaf was found dead in his rented room. The official cause of death was apoplexy, sudden heart failure. He was 38 years old with no history of health problems. The room showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. Samuel appeared to have died peacefully in his sleep. But all of his notes, all of his carefully collected documents and testimony relating to Bellerive had vanished. Dr. Fentress, who performed yet another examination of yet another unexpected death connected to Bellerive, noted in his private records that this was now the fourth sudden death in less than a year. The pattern troubled him deeply. But he had no medical evidence of foul play, no proof beyond the disturbing frequency of these deaths. He scheduled a meeting with Sheriff Theriot to discuss his concerns. Before that meeting could occur, Moses paid him a visit. They spoke for approximately 2 hours in Dr. Fentress's office. The conversation began with medical matters. Moses asked detailed questions about various illnesses, their symptoms, their progression, their treatment. Then Moses made a statement that the doctor would never forget. "You understand, doctor, that the world operates according to natural laws. Sometimes people die for reasons that are perfectly natural, but appear suspicious to those who don't understand the complexity of human mortality. It would be unfortunate if such misunderstandings led a respected physician to make accusations he could not substantiate, accusations that might damage his reputation and practice irreparably." It was not explicitly a threat, but the implication was clear. Dr. Fentress cancelled his meeting with Sheriff Theriot. He never spoke publicly about his suspicions regarding the deaths at Bellerive. In his private journal that evening, he wrote, "I have today chosen cowardice over courage. I suspect I have allowed evil to continue unchecked because I lack the strength to confront it. May God forgive me for what I have failed to do." By the summer of 1853, Moses had achieved something that should have been impossible under every law and custom of the antebellum South. He had gone from laid property to free man to legal owner of one of the most valuable plantations in Ascension Parish, all in the span of 13 months. The cost of this transformation, measured in human lives, remained unknown but was suspected to be substantial. The winter of 1853 to 1854 brought growing pressure from multiple directions. In January, a group of neighboring planters sent a formal petition to the state legislature in Baton Rouge requesting tighter restrictions on manumission. The petition didn't mention Moses by name, but everyone understood its target. The legislature debated the matter extensively but ultimately took no action. The first serious legal threat came in March 1854, when a New Orleans lawyer named Philip Dufresne appeared in Ascension Parish claiming to represent Henri Beauchamp's distant relatives in France. They were challenging the validity of Henri's will, arguing that he had been mentally incompetent or under duress when he revised it. The lawsuit aimed to overturn the entire inheritance, which would strip Celeste of her property and Moses of his control over Bellerive. Moses responded by hiring Charles Fournier, one of the most prominent lawyers in New Orleans, a man negating the complexities of Louisiana's unique legal system, which blended French civil law with American common law. The legal battle proceeded through the spring of 1854. In April, a barn at Bellerive caught fire in the middle of the night, destroying valuable equipment and nearly spreading to the sugar mill. The investigation revealed that the fire had started in 3 separate locations simultaneously, strongly suggesting arson. No one was ever charged. In May, someone fired a shot at Moses as he rode along the plantation road in broad daylight. The shot missed. The shooter escaped into the cane fields and was never identified. These incidents made clear that Moses's enemies had moved beyond social ostracism to active attempts to drive him out or kill him. The most significant development involved Margot. Her position as Celeste's personal maid gave her intimate knowledge of everything occurring in the main house. She had observed the relationship between Moses and Celeste evolve over years. She had carried notes between them. She had been present during private conversations, and she had kept certain things hidden. In June 1854, Margot approached Father Leblanc during one of his pastoral visits to Bellerive. She told him, in hushed and frightened tones, that she believed Moses had murdered Henri, and that she had evidence. Letters between Celeste and Moses that predated Henri's death by several months. Letters that demonstrated a relationship that was intimate and conspiratorial. Letters that discussed plans for the future. Plans that could only come to fruition if Henri were no longer alive. Margot had hidden these letters, keeping them safe against the day when she might need to reveal them. That day, she believed, had come. Father Leblanc was deeply disturbed by what Margot told him. He understood the implications. If what she said was true, then Moses and Celeste had conspired to murder Henri, and everyone who had stood in Moses's way since then had likely met the same fate. The priest made a decision. He would write to the bishop in New Orleans, describing the situation in detail and requesting guidance on how to proceed. That letter was written on June 20th, 1854. It was intercepted before it ever reached the bishop. On the night of June 23rd, Father Leblanc was found unconscious on the road between Bellerive and his church. His horse stood nearby, apparently having thrown its rider. The priest had suffered severe injuries to his head. He died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. The official explanation was a tragic accident, a nervous horse, a road made treacherous by recent rain, an unfortunate combination of circumstances. But Margot understood immediately what had happened. She took the letters and documents she had hidden and fled Bellerive in the middle of the night, heading toward New Orleans on foot. She believed that if she could reach the city, if she could present the evidence to proper authorities, Moses would finally face justice. She made it approximately 15 miles before she was found. The official account stated she had been detained by a patrol watching for runaways. She had not possessed papers authorizing her to travel. During the detention, she became agitated and violent. She suffered fatal injuries in the struggle that ensued. The documents she had been carrying were lost. Destroyed in the confusion, the patrol captain explained. No investigation was conducted into the circumstances of her death. No inquiry was made into what had happened to the papers she carried. Celeste did not attend Margot's burial. Moses sent a wreath on her grave. In August 1854, the lawsuit filed by Philip de Frezin reached a critical phase. Depositions were scheduled to begin in September. Testimony would be taken from servants who had worked at Bellerive, from business associates of Henri's, from anyone who might shed light on the circumstances of his death and the revision of his will. It represented a significant threat to Moses's position. The night before the depositions were scheduled to begin, Philip de Frezin was attacked in his hotel room in New Orleans. 2 men beat him severely, leaving him with injuries that would plague him for the rest of his life. They stole all his legal papers relating to the Beauchamp case, every document, every piece of evidence, every witness statement he had collected. De Frezin survived the attack but was left partially paralyzed and unable to continue practicing law. The attackers were never identified. The stolen documents were never recovered. With de Frezin incapacitated and his documentation destroyed, the lawsuit collapsed. In October 1854, the court dismissed the challenge to Henri's will. Moses's ownership of Bellerive was confirmed as legally valid. He had won again. But the attack on de Frezin marked a turning point in how people viewed the situation at Bellerive. Everyone now understood that Mose was not simply fortunate, not merely clever at navigating legal complexities. He was willing to use violence, willing to kill anyone who threatened his position, and he had the recent connections to do so with impunity. In November 1854, Colonel Auguste Chevalier organized a secret meeting of neighboring planters at his home. 23 men attended. They discussed the situation at Bellerive for over 3 hours. The consensus was clear. Legal methods had failed. Social pressure had proven ineffective. Economic isolation had not broken Moses's position. What remained was extralegal action. A committee was formed. 3 men who would plan carefully and execute discreetly. The goal was to eliminate Moses in a way that could be attributed to accident or natural causes, to avoid the mistakes that had led to Father Leblanc's obvious murder. The names of the 3 men on this committee were never recorded in any document, but Moses learned about the meeting within 48 hours of its conclusion. He responded by hiring guards from New Orleans, men with reputations for violence, former soldiers, river pirates, the kinds of men who asked no questions and followed orders without hesitation. Moses transformed Bellerive into a fortress. He varied his routines, never traveled alone, never followed predictable patterns, always had armed men within sight. In December 1854, one of the 3 men believed to be on the assassination committee, a planter named Lucien Brassard, was found dead in his home, killed by a shotgun blast through a window. The investigation concluded it was a hunting accident, a neighbor cleaning his weapon. A terrible mistake. But the message was clear. Moses knew who planning to kill him, and he had struck first. On Christmas Eve 1854, someone fired 6 shots at Moses as he returned to Bellerive after a business meeting in the parish seat. His guards returned fire. 2 people died in the exchange. One of Moses's guards and one attacker, who was identified as a man employed by a twine merchant, another prominent planter. A merchant fled the pike night. He was never seen in Louisiana again. Colonel Chevalier, the man who had organized the secret meeting, survived 3 more weeks before dying in January 1855. The official cause was pneumonia, though his symptoms bore a striking resemblance to the intestinal illness that had killed Tobias Greenleaf, Old Jacks, and others who had opposed Moses. By early 1855, Moses had systematically eliminated or driven away everyone who had actively threatened him. He had proven that he could not be dislodged through legal means, could not be killed through assassination, could not be defeated by the method his enemies employed. But this victory came at a cost that extended beyond the body count. Bellerive existed in complete social isolation. Moses had what he had fought for: freedom, a property, power, legal status as a free man and plantation owner. But he possessed these things within a prison of his own making, surrounded by hired guards, living with a wife who barely spoke, cut off from any meaningful human connection. The documents suggest that by the spring of 1859, Moses had been the effective master of Bellerive for nearly 7 years. The estate continued generating profits, although the isolation had taken its economic toll. Moses could sell his sugar, but always at reduced prices because of his reputation. He could hire workers, but only those desperate enough to overlook the stories. Celeste's mental state deteriorated dramatically over those years. She rarely left her chambers. She spoke to people who were not present. She moved through the house like a ghost, pale and silent, living in some interior world that no one else could access. Dr. Fentress, who continued to attend her periodically, could offer no diagnosis beyond melancholia, a wasting away the spirit that no medicine could treat. In May 1859, Louisa died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72. Before her death, she had prepared a sealed letter addressed to Dr. Fentress with instructions that it be opened only after she was gone. The letter contained her account of everything she had witnessed over 7 years. The mysterious meetings, the suspicious deaths, the systematic elimination of anyone who might challenge Moses, the evidence of planning between Moses and Celeste that predated Henri's death. It was not legal evidence, it was hearsay, the observations of an elderly woman with no formal education. But it provided a comprehensive narrative of Moses's transformation from slave to master, achieved through what Louisa believed was calculated murder. Fentress read the letter and faced the decision that had haunted him for years. He made a copy of Louisa's account, sealed the original with instructions that it be opened after his own death, and deposited it with his lawyer in New Orleans. If Moses killed him, at least the truth would eventually emerge. But Moses did not kill Dr. Fentress. By the summer of 1859, Moses seemed to have lost interest in eliminating potential threats. Perhaps because there were no threats left. Perhaps because he had achieved what he sought and found it hollow. In August 1859, Moses made an announcement that shocked everyone who heard it. He would free all enslaved people remaining on the plantation. Immediate and complete freedom for 73 people. He would provide them with papers, with money for their journey if they wished to leave, and with the option to remain as paid workers if they chose. The economic implications were staggering. Without enslaved labor, Bellerive's entire agriculture operation would collapse. The cane fields could not be worked. The mill could not be operated. The plantation would become economically worthless. But Moses proceeded anyway. He filed them in emission papers. He made arrangements for those who wanted to leave Louisiana entirely. He negotiated contracts with those who chose to stay. The decision mystified observers. Why would Moses destroy the economic foundation of everything he had fought to obtain? The answer, according to documents discovered later, was that Moses had come to a realization. He had spent his entire life in slavery, then fought his way to freedom and ownership. But continuing to operate Bellerive as a slave plantation made him complicit in the same system that had enslaved him. He had simply changed positions within the system without changing the system itself. Freeing the people he owned was an attempt to break that cycle, to prove that his transformation meant something beyond mere role reversal. But it came too late to matter. Without enslaved labor, the fields lay fallow, the mill stood idle. By October 1859, Moses had essentially dismantled the economic engine that had made Bellerive valuable. Celeste's condition reached its crisis point that same autumn. In September, she stopped eating entirely. She refused all food, took only water. Dr. Fentress found her in a state of profound physical and mental collapse, conscious but unresponsive, existing in a state between life and death. Celeste Beauchamp died on October 17, 1859, 7 years and 4 months after Henri's death. The official cause was wasting disease combined with severe melancholia. Moses did not attend her funeral. He sent only a wreath and a brief note that read, "May she find the peace that eluded her in life." After Celeste's death, Moses was the sole owner of Bellerive. No legal challenges remained. No heirs could claim the property. He had finally achieved absolute control, and he discovered it meant nothing to him. In November, he began selling off parts of Bellerive. The mill first to a consortium of investors, then sections of land to neighboring planters who were willing to overlook his reputation for the sake of expanding their holdings. Equipment, livestock, furniture. By December, only the main house and a few surrounding acres remained. On December 28, 1859, Moses summoned Dr. Fentress to Bellerive. The doctor found him in Henri's former study, sitting at the same desk where Henri had supposedly killed himself 7.5 years earlier. Moses was surrounded by documents, account books, legal papers, letters. He looked physically but emotionally exhausted in a way that transcended mere fatigue. Moses poured brandy for both of them and began to speak. What he said during that conversation, Fentress would later record in meticulous detail in his personal journal. Moses did not confess to murder, not explicitly, but he spoke about the nature of power, about what it cost to obtain and maintain, about the calculations to survive in a system designed to destroy you. He spoke about slavery and freedom, about how both involved forms of control, about how the difference between master and slave was often less significant than people believed. He spoke about Celeste, about how their relationship had begun years before Henri's death, about how they had both been trapped in circumstances they could not escape through legitimate means, about how they had planned together to create circumstances that would allow them both freedom. He did not say explicitly that they had killed Henri, but the implication was clear. He did not detail the other deaths, did not list names or methods, but he acknowledged that many obstacles had been removed, that necessary actions had been taken, that prices had been paid. Most disturbing to Dr. Fentress was Moses's discussion of regret, not moral regret for the people killed, not remorse for lives destroyed, but practical regret that his methods had isolated him so completely that victory became indistinguishable from defeat. That he had achieved an impossible transformation but created a life that satisfied him less than the one he had escaped. At the end of their conversation, Moses asked Dr. Fentress a question. If you could know with absolute certainty that a terrible injustice would be corrected through terrible methods, would you accept that bargain? Would you sacrifice others, many others, to achieve something that should never have been denied to you in the first place? Dr. Fentress replied that he did not know, that he could not answer such a question honestly. Moses smiled at that. A sad, knowing smile. That is the only correct answer, he said. Anyone who answers confidently does not understand the question. That was the last time Dr. Fentress saw Moses Beauchamp. On January 12, 1860, Moses disappeared from Bellerive. He took with him whatever wealth he had accumulated from selling the plantation's assets. A substantial sum, according to bank records that would later be examined. He left no note, no indication of where he was going, no forwarding address. The house stood empty for several weeks before neighbors noticed that it had been abandoned entirely. The remaining property reverted to the state for unpaid taxes. No one ever saw Moses Beauchamp again. There were rumors, of course. Sightings reported across the South and beyond. A wealthy man matching Moses' description was reported in Mexico City in 1862, a successful merchant in New York in 1865, a property owner in California in 1871. But nothing was ever confirmed. Moses disappeared as if he had never existed. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Moses was justified in his actions, or do his methods make him irredeemable? Or could he have achieved freedom through other means, or did the system leave him no choice but violence? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. The story of Moses Beauchamp became a dark legend in Ascension Parish, Louisiana. People told different versions of it, emphasizing different elements depending on their perspective. Some portrayed Moses as a brilliant tactician who beat an oppressive system at its own game. Others described him as a monster who murdered his way to power without conscience or remorse. The truth, as preserved in documents discovered decades later, was more disturbing than either legend suggested. Fentress's journal, discovered after his death in 1871, provided the most comprehensive account based on direct observation. Louisa's sealed letter offered corroborating details from the household perspective. Together, they guessed that Moses had been directly or indirectly responsible for at least 9 deaths. Henri Beauchamp, Tobias Greenleaf, Old Jacques, Samuel Greenleaf, Father Leblanc, Margot, a Lucien Brassard, the guard killed on Christmas Eve, and Josiah, the field worker who disappeared. They also suggested that Celeste had been not merely a passive victim, but an active participant in at least some of what occurred. That the relationship between Moses and Celeste had begun while Henri was still alive. That they had planned together, conspired together. But these documents also revealed something more complex than simple criminality. They showed a man who had been shaped by a system that treated human beings as property. That denied people agency, autonomy, and humanity based solely on the color of their skin. That created conditions where the only path to freedom was through violence and deception. The system had created Moses Beauchamp by denying him every legitimate avenue to the life he believed he deserved. The legal questions surrounding Bellerive were never fully resolved. The deaths that occurred between 1852 and 1859 remained officially unsolved. No charges were ever filed. No trial was ever held. The only person who faced any legal consequence was Philip de Fresne, who survived his attack but never practiced law again, his body broken and his spirit destroyed by what he had experienced. In 1868, a northern journalist named Theodore Wexler traveled to Louisiana to investigate the Bellerive story for a magazine article. He interviewed dozens of people who had known Moses or lived in Ascension Parish during those years. Most refused to speak about it at all. Those who did speak offered contradictory accounts that could not be reconciled. Wexler did uncover one intriguing detail, however. In 1867, a man matching Moses' description had been seen in Veracruz, Mexico, operating a successful merchant business. The man called himself Maurice Beaumont. He was accepted in society as white. He was prosperous and respected. Wexler traveled to Veracruz to confirm the identification. But by the time he arrived, the man calling himself Maurice Beaumont had moved on. No one knew where. The final piece of the puzzle emerged in 1903, when a collection of legal correspondence was donated to the Louisiana Historical Society by the family of Edward Lafleur, the lawyer who had represented Moses during the probate proceedings. Among the papers was a series of letters from a client who signed only as M.B. The letters, dated between 1860 and 1897, discussed various financial and legal matters. The transfer of funds, the establishment of business, the purchase of property. In one letter dated 1889, nearly 30 years after Moses disappeared from Bellerive, M.B., wrote something that suggested deep reflection on what had occurred. I have lived for many years now under a different name, free of the burden of who I was and what I did. I have been successful, respected. I have harmed no one since leaving Louisiana, yet I remain haunted by the question of whether my transformation was worth the price others paid. I traded their lives for my freedom, and I cannot determine whether this was justice or crime, revolution or murder. The letter continued. I know that history will judge me harshly if my story is ever fully told. I accept this judgment even as I maintain that I had no other path available. The system that enslaved me created the man who destroyed that system from within. If I am guilty of crimes, then slavery itself stands guilty of creating me. The blood is on many hands, not merely mine. Whether these letters were actually written by Moses Beauchamp cannot be proven with certainty. The handwriting analysis is inconclusive. The signature could be anyone's initials, but they suggest that Moses survived for at least 37 years after disappearing from Bellerive, that he established a new life successfully, that he achieved the freedom and prosperity he had fought for, and that he spent those years grappling with the moral implications of how he had achieved his transformation. The story became a cautionary tale in Louisiana, told differently depending on who was telling it and who was listening. To some, it proved the danger of upsetting the social order, of what happened when people refused to accept their assigned place. To others, it demonstrated slavery's corrupting influence, how the system destroyed not only those it enslaved, but also those who participated in maintaining it. To still others, it was simply an exaggerated legend, a story that grew in the telling, a myth constructed from fragments of truth and embellished with imagination. The main house at Bellerive was demolished in 1887. The land was subdivided and sold to multiple buyers. By 1900, nothing remained to mark where the plantation had stood except a few foundation stones gradually being reclaimed by the Louisiana wilderness. The cemetery where Henri fell into neglect for decades before being restored in 1956 as part of a parish historical preservation project. Henri's gravestone reads, Henri Beauchamp, 1807-1852, beloved husband of Bellerive, Celestes reads Celeste Beauchamp, 1826-1859. May she rest in peace. No stone marks Moses' grave because no one knows where or when he died. Perhaps he lived many more years under his new identity, as the letters suggest. Perhaps he died shortly after leaving Louisiana, and the letters were forgeries created by someone else for unknown purposes. Perhaps he spent the rest of life looking over his shoulder, waiting for someone to recognize him, waiting for the past to catch up with him. We will never know with certainty. What we do know is this: a man born into slavery in Louisiana found himself in circumstances that offered no legitimate path to freedom, no legal avenue to the life he believed he deserved, and no way to escape the system that defined him as property except through actions that violated every moral and legal boundary. He chose to act anyway. He transformed himself from to master in 13 months, through what appears to have been systematic murder, manipulation, and exploitation of every weakness in the system that oppressed him. He achieved his goal, and then discovered that victory left him isolated, empty, and haunted by the methods he had employed. The story leaves us with profoundly uncomfortable questions that have no easy answers. Was Moses Beauchamp a hero or a villain? Was his transformation an act of liberation or an act of evil? Were his methods justified by the impossibility of achieving freedom through legitimate means? Or do they damn him regardless of his circumstances? Did he prove that individuals can overcome oppressive systems through intelligence and ruthlessness? Or did he simply demonstrate that oppression creates monsters? Should we judge him by the standards of his time, when slavery was legal and accepted by much of white society, or by universal moral standards that transcend historical context? These questions remain relevant because the conditions that created Moses Beauchamp have never fully disappeared from human society. Wherever systems exist that deny people agency based on arbitrary characteristics, wherever power is distributed unfairly, wherever legitimate paths to justice are blocked, wherever oppression forces individuals to choose between submission and violence, there will be people like Moses, are brilliant and ruthless, refusing to accept their assigned position, willing to pay any price, anyone's price, to transform themselves, and we will continue to struggle with how to judge them. The documents don't lie about what happened at Bellerive Plantation between 1852 and 1860, but they cannot answer the deeper questions about whether those events represent justice or crime, revolution or murder, liberation or damnation. Those judgments belong to each of us to make, based on our own understanding of morality, justice, and the limits of what can be justified by oppression. What do you think happened at Bellerive? Was Moses Beauchamp a freedom fighter or a murderer? Could the same person be both? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more mysteries rooted in real history, more stories that were deliberately buried and forgotten, subscribe to Whispers of Mystery and hit the notification bell. Share this video with someone who appreciates history's uncomfortable truths, because the past is never as simple as we want it to be, and understanding its complexity is the only way to avoid repeating its worst mistakes. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.